Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Tebogo Makube. I'm currently the acting Deputy Director General for the sectors branch at the dtic. So welcome to this TIPS development dialogue. And the topic, it's on petrochemicals in the context of South Africa's energy transition and analysis of Secunda. I have eminent panelists here. So as a discussant, we have Ms. Pamela Mondliwa, who's the head of research at the IDC. Also, as part of the panel is Dr. Rod Crompton, who has written quite a lot on the topic, and there are papers which have been shared with you. Also, there's Dr. Bruce Young, who's a chemical engineer and a business development professional, will also discuss on the issue. Again, we have Mr. Tristan Han, is the CEO of TH Eco Ventures and is also having a considerable experience in the sector, particularly chemicals, refinery, and energy industries. So the reason why we have this dialogue is because of the importance of the chemical sector, in particular the petrochemical sector in the South African economy. And my reading on it is that the estimate is that the chemicals industry contributes to about 5% to the GDP. And in terms of the manufacturing sales, it's about 20% or 25% roughly. And that's the estimate, because my understanding is that it takes chemicals to produce chemicals. So, to then estimate the actual value in terms of the contribution to GDP, there's an extensive analysis to be done. So, but those are the estimates. But then if you view deeper into the role of Sasol in the South African economy and global as well, is a fund that is located in 22 countries, but its products are sold in 120 countries. But Secunda it's critical in terms of the production and the value addition in the South African economy. Again, another analysis that one can do is the market cap of Sasol. All right. So if you go to as at February 2025, its market cap on the JSE has been 53.25 billion, which is about 2.8 billion USD dollars. So Sasol is listed both on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and as well as the New York Stock Exchange. So it's a very big company. So what does then the risk, the future of Sasol, if we are facing challenges in Secunda? So the impact will be dire, not only to the South African economy. There will be a multiplier effect both in terms of downstream industries, employment, taxation in the country. So yesterday you could not pass the budget because of tax, right? So what we learned is that there was a dispute on the value-added tax. So you can, if we reduce production or we lose Secunda, there will be impacts on the tax. It's a value-added tax. It's the corporate income tax. It's the PIT, personal income tax, and other taxes associated with that. Now, also the outlook is not promising if you consider the implementation of CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe and the UK, which is basically, tariffs to deal with the importation of goods with carbon. And we, studies by the eminent panelists here is that is going to create the problem. So without necessarily then stealing the thunder, let me now allow my panelists, and starting with Dr. Rod Crompton, to share with us what might be the challenge faced by Sasol, particularly in Secunda, and the solutions for us to consider as a country. Over to you, Rod. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you here. And thank you for that kind introduction, Tebogo. There's a number of thanks we'd like to give. I'd like to start off by thanking the Minister of Finance for postponing his budget speech. For this, you said it was for tax. I thought it was for the seminar, but okay, I'm just kidding. Yeah, thank you to TIPS and its funders for seeing the importance of petrochemicals. It's a drum that I've been banging on for some time in this economy, and it's good that it's getting some recognition. I'd also like to thank Sasol for its cooperation, and Kodrit Rustamji, our research assistant, for all the hard work he did, and for this opportunity. So this is going to be a bit of a choir effort. I'm going to talk a bit, and then Bruce, and then Tristan, and then you'll have me again at the end. So there'll be a bit of sitting down and standing up going on through the course of the presentation. We just want to make it clear these views are not the views of University of Witwatersrand or Wits Business School or the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. These are our personal views. This is the report, and what we are trying to do here in a short space of time is condense 120 odd pages of quite dense material into a few slides. So it's not possible, obviously, to cover everything. As it says, that was commissioned in 23, and we finished off in October last year. And it's available on the TIPS website. So this is the sort of 8 topics that we'll cover very briefly, starting with Sasol's origins, decarbonisation, feedstock issues, shareholder issues, modelling, economic modelling, possibilities of transforming Secunda, because this is really about the energy transition, and policy recommendations. So starting at the beginning, Sasol Secunda was a strategic initiative, originally known as Sasol 2 and 3, built in 1980 or commissioned in 1980-82 for strategic reasons. It sits on top of a low-grade coal resource, and so it adds considerable value to that low-grade resource. Climate change was not an issue when this was decided, when government decided to do this. It was privatized in stages from 1979 onwards, and listed on the JSE with guaranteed pricing support through a quite complicated pricing mechanism. So the important point is Sasol's technology in Secunda, it's designed for coal. It's not designed for other feedstocks. It's designed for coal. And like humans, our diet is quite restrictive in terms of what we can consume, but other animals can consume a wider range of feedstocks. Sasol's diet has to be mainly coal. Natural gas can supplement the coal, but it can't substitute for coal. And the main products coming out of this giant machine are petrol, diesel, jet fuel, and importantly, for this economy, petrochemicals. The chemical feedstocks are co-products. You can't have the one without the other. And that's an important point to understand as we start talking about recommendations later on in this presentation. So Tebogo has done this slide for me already. I'm not going to run through all the details there of what a big chunk of the economy this plant is and contributes. You can see all the numbers there, employees and tax and so on he mentioned. A point that's often missed, though, is that there are two towns dependent on Sasol. One is the town called Secunda that was specially built next to Sasol 2 and 3, and the other one is Sasolburg, where Sasol 1 was built in 1954. It was the original site of Fischer-Tropsch Technologies in South Africa. So the thing is, it's a major contributor to this economy. But it's not just the economic contribution you have to think about. It's the particular petrochemical contribution which is really important. And we're going to talk more about that as we go along. So let me hand over to Tristan.
Morning, everyone. I think COVID was a time of great change starting in 2020, and we all kind of started seeing the light at the end of the tunnel sometimes in 2021. And part of that change was a reawakening of climate change. Last being very popular in the mid-2000s when I first got into the space, and kind of petered out, and then has been reignited with how to restart the global economy. Sasol over time has been experiencing increased and growing shareholder, stakeholder pressure in terms of what to do about carbon. And up until this point, their targets were efficiency, intensity-based targets, consistent with the rest of industry. And in September 2021, they announced two very bold absolute targets: net zero by 2050, and then a 30% reduction in scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 2030, off a 2017 baseline. You can read some of the announcements over there, detailed assessments, and a sustainable transition. Also, in parallel, there were announcements, no new investments in coal mines, and this was reaffirmed as recently as last year. So what does this all mean? Sasol South Africa has a carbon footprint which, if it were measured as a country, is around 55 in the world, 50% larger than Norway. So that's a substantial amount of carbon that you need to deal with. And here's a graph of the emissions since 2017, which is the baseline year, and then the two targets in 2030 and 2050, basically projecting a drop of around 2.5 million tons a year. These are tough targets. There's not a lot of coal industries that have announced targets of this magnitude. Made more tough, as Bruce will talk through later, by, for instance, declining natural gas. It's a great feedstock. It's packed full of hydrogen. And if you look at this graph, these two phases that Sasol speaks of, the first one is dominated by things like renewable electricity, and that enables a whole lot of nice things around reducing coal. And the crux of that is coal briquetting. not as easy as it seems. Obviously, all of this requires money, and these are integrated projects. So you've got to pull them all off at the same time and land them by 2030. That obviously means there's some lumpiness in this process as projects have to be approved and executed. But there's not a lot of time, 6 years, to start pulling those numbers down. And then post 2030 is the realm of green hydrogen and green carbon. Those are also very tough. Bruce has a crack at trying to back calculate the numbers of what we think that would look like on with today's technology. So, and I think what's also important to remember here, this is just the carbon dimension. There's also pressure on other environmental fronts, most particularly sulfur, but also emissions and things from boilers. So there's multiple environmental pressures. There's opportunities built into that plan to tackle these all at once. But integration saves money, but adds complexity. You've got to, as I said earlier, you've got to pull all of these things together simultaneously. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all. I hope that there's a little bit of life left in this old dog. Start off by talking about coal, okay? And coal, I think when you think about Sasol, you need to think about coal. Sasol is a coal mining company. I'm going to say the coal miners would cheer about that. And historically, you know, Sasol was an upstream and there's a downstream component to coal. And certainly in my career, I worked in the downstream area, so I don't profess to be a super expert on coal, but I know enough about Secunda to know that it's a coal mining company. And so, as Rod said, Secunda was built on top of the coal fields. And Secunda's been operating for more than 40 years. So there's been a lot of coal mining that's been happening in those 40 years. And so it's not surprising that the close coal has been mined out and that the good quality coal was mined first. So things are becoming more challenging now. And let's just think about, in the early 2000s, about 50 million tons per annum of coal was mined by Sasol. And by 2023, that had declined to 33 million tons per annum. So that's a significant decline in the amount of coal that Sasol mined. And then, as Tristan said, you know, Sasol's announced there are no new coal mines. Then I've mentioned the coal quality issue, which impacts production ultimately. Of course, there is a destoning project which is underway to improve the quality. So Sasol's trying to address some of these issues here. But then let's look at that graph and see the external purchases of coal. So, you know, that's steadily ramping up, and those will need to increase. And they come from further away, and that ultimately increases cost. So the costs are increasing, and that means that it's reducing the margins and profitability of Secunda. And let's talk about, we've talked about coal, and then the other feedstock, of course, is gas. And I think let's just start with that graph on the left. For those who have been following gas in South Africa, we speak of the gas cliff. That's not a term that we invented. It's based on this decline of gas from southern Mozambique. And this is a given. I think Sasol started actually mentioning that in the 20F in 2018 already. And it started and it's going to continue, and there's nothing we can do about it. That graph, of course, is an estimate. There's been talks about what's called extending the plateau, so it could move slightly to the right. But then, of course, Sasol has announced that in 2027, that the industrial customers, the non-Sasol customers, will be cut off. And that's where the term the gas cliff comes from. So the Mozambican gas anchors Sasolburg, half of Sasolburg, and supplements Secunda by about 10% by mass. And as Tristan mentioned, actually, it's a bit more than that in the sense that methane is hydrogen rich. So it's a very important feedstock for Secunda. And then Sasol is the main user of the gas from Mozambique. So LNG imports are under study, but Sasol can't afford it. And that's not a statement that I, as Bruce Young, is making. Sasol has announced that it can't afford it. So let's just briefly touch on LNG and the LNG import. It's uncertain without Sasol because of about the 180 petajoules per annum that comes from Mozambique. Sasol uses something over 100, and 60% goes to other industrial, 60 petajoules goes to other industrial customers, which is not enough to justify an LNG import terminal. So power projects are essential. And the clock is ticking from now till 2027. So it's just uncertain what's going to happen. So, but even apart from LNG import, we can go and look at that tail off there. The Sasolburg and the Secunda are also going to face this declining situation. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of production output? So historically, within Sasol, there was always a production target from Secunda of about 7.5 million tons per annum of production. So that was a very important target. Some years it was below that, some years it was above that, and there was always a focus on trying to maintain that production target. Now, as you can imagine, for a very capital-intensive operation like Secunda, maintaining production is very important. Fixed costs are very high, and profitability is closely tied to production. So Tristan touched on the issue of emissions reduction by 2030, and Sasol announced that that would entail an 11% cut in production. So you can see there on that graph, there's a step change down in 2030 to 6.7 million tons. And then, of course, at some point the gas runs out, as we showed on the previous graph, and that implies a further cut in production to about 6.1 million tons. So you can see we're facing a fairly significant, I think that's 19% in total, a fairly significant cut in production. And as we mentioned before, fixed costs are high. So this is something that's going to impact, hurt margins due to the fixed costs. Now talk about shareholder value and financial position of Sasol. And first of all, just why are we talking about that? Well, a company's share price reflects its overall health. I guess the analogy I like to use, you know, if you go to the doctor, he does some measurements and talks about how healthy you are based on various things that he measures, like your cholesterol level if you're getting older and you eat the wrong things. So the share price is one of the things the doctor of your financial health looks at. And I want to talk about kind of three eras in Sasol's history, starting in about 2000. So in the 2000 to 2008, the share price went from 30 Rand to 500 Rand. It's a 16-fold increase, more or less. And that was a period where Sasol was doing very well, well regarded by the market. Sasol employees who got share options did extremely well from that. And so those were wonderful times. Then in 2008 to 2018, and you can look at the numbers on that graph, the share price stagnated. There was a lot of volatility, and of course the oil price goes up and down. But if you look over that whole period, basically the share price stagnated. Of course, good dividends were paid, and Sasol was a healthy company. And then from 2018 to 2025, which is now, the share price declined, and declined a lot. There are many reasons for that, but I just pick on one. The LCCP cost overruns were a big problem, from $8.1 billion when it was approved to $12.9 billion when it was actually completed. And so that led to a debt issue. The COVID didn't help, and there were forced asset sales. But I just want to quickly talk about some of the other things on that graph. And I know it's a bit small, but I want to talk about a heuristic that analysts used and was well known within Sasol. So the heuristic was that if you took the dollar oil price of Brent crude and you halved it, that more or less told you the Sasol share price. And so you can see here, there's some numbers I put on that graph, in 2008 and 2014, and you can see that heuristic applied. When the share price decline started, then that heuristic broke down. And we've got a figure there, in 2023, it was no longer 50%, it was now 17%. And I did a calculation yesterday, now it's 6%. So this shows you that there's some financial health issues here. And so this market valuation has a concerning trajectory with an uncertain future. Let's just look at the financial position of the organization. So first of all, we can look at debt, total debt, which is there measured in Rand. And you can see that over the 10-year period from 2013 to 2023, debt increased compound average growth rate by about 18% a year, which is a lot. You can see there that it peaked in 2020, and then there were the forced asset sales, and then debt went down and then increased a little bit since then. But overall, an 18% increase in debt over the 10 years. Then let's look at EBITDA. The EBITDA there is measured in Rand. So, that increased by a compound average growth rate of 1% measured in Rand. But when you measure it in dollars, it actually fell by 5.5% annually. So, and while debt rose 10.4%. So cost cutting and restructuring remain ongoing in Sasol, because obviously that's one of the ways you have to deal with this. And then this financial decline explains the shareholder value loss. Just a quick word on that bottom graph. That's the debt to EBITDA ratio. And of course, that's something that when you have debt covenants, that can trigger things. And certainly in 2020, when it reached 5, then debt covenants were not met, and banks stepped in and forced asset sales were required. Okay, I'm going to hand back over to Tristan.
So what Bruce was looking at in the previous slide was share price history. And in some sense, that's backward looking. But obviously, one of the key focus areas of this report is about the carbon price and what's it going to do in future. So now, what are you going to do about a forward-looking view? And I think all of us like to talk about the plans we have. It's very exciting. But ultimately, it comes down to money and affordability. And Sasol South Africa is very complex, very integrated operation, comprising principally Secunda and Sasolburg. Perhaps the only thing as complex are the hundreds of pages of financials and investor information that's available. And so the question out there is, well, so how are we going to analyze this and make sense of it in a level that we can actually work with it without drowning ourselves in complexity? And we took the approach of less is more. There's always a temptation to try and make something more accurate, but eventually the extra detail just tends to drown out the message. We're trying to get a big picture here and capture the important effects that are going to drive what this future looks like. So essentially, we were able to reduce this to something which I think is at the level of grade 12 accounting, or at least when I was doing grade 12 accounting back in the day. And like all businesses, what's important, the fixed cost, how much you sell things for, what is your variable cost? And with some effort, and there's a lot of information out there, you can back calculate, make assumptions, and come up with a fairly simple picture that allows you to look at this. As Bruce mentioned earlier, it's important to keep running. This is in dollars. There's a very large component of fixed costs that aren't moving. This is not unusual for heavy energy-intensive type industries, be it mining or Secunda, coal-fired power stations. So you need to run, and you need to run your 340, 350 days a year, because you want to work your way up this line up until you hit a break-even point, conveniently selected or somewhat accidentally in blue. This is the water level. Your aim is to get above that, because that's where profits start. So you need to keep on running. And these lines represent different carbon prices. They're effectively how much profit you're making. You're selling stuff for 100, it's costing us 50. The more we sell, the more we make. We climb up this curve. But then obviously carbon taxes subtract from that. And the bigger the carbon tax, the more this line flattens. And effectively it has the effect of you need to run for longer to, all other things being equal, to break even at the same number. And I think what's important here, and perhaps not recognized, is that Secunda is very carbon intensive at around 8 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of product, compared to the other competing processes that are out there. And when you run that through the numbers, and we've used as example $30 a ton CO2, these numbers add up very rapidly. I started in climate change in the mid-2000s. A number like 30 was a shocking number. We didn't believe, the calculations suggested something of that order. It wasn't something we believed at the time. But here we are today, and in fact, EU ETS sometimes it's $100 a ton if you're in a fully closed CO2 type of environment. $30 a ton, is it a lot? If you just run through the maths, $30 a ton, 500 Rand a ton of CO2 times 55 million. I think that's close to 30 billion Rand a year. These are big numbers. And you can see that effect happening over here. And obviously, people worry about and talk about a South African carbon tax, but this is not just, climate change is a global thing. Europeans are trying to globalize it with CBAM. So there's both internal pressures coming from within and also external with CBAM. Next year marks the start of chemical CBAM for fertilizers, steel, aluminium, and a few other products, electricity. I think it is on scope 1 emissions, but this is coming. Probably past, they haven't announced exactly yet when Secunda's products will fall into that space, but in the early to mid 2030s, I think is a reasonable assumption. So you can see here today, this green line, $30 a ton. Secunda is going to struggle with $30 a ton. You take close to tens of billions of rands away from anybody. You're going to feel that pressure. $30 a ton, Secunda is going to feel that pressure. And I think the important message we're trying to get through here, Sasol already has a lot of challenges to deal with outside of CO2. You need to think very carefully about what CO2 is appropriate given the role that Sasol plays in the economy and what that future looks like for us as a country and for them as a company. Thanks.
Thanks, Tristan. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about greening Secunda. So talking about whether what it would entail for Secunda to go to sustainable feedstocks. So let me just start by saying, and I'm just going to try and explain this in the simplest terms possible. So Secunda makes hydrocarbons. So what are hydrocarbons? They're a mixture of carbon and hydrogen. And we've just said chains of CH2. So it's one carbon atom and two hydrogen atoms. That's an approximation, of course, but it's roughly correct. So when you talk about sustainable feedstocks, you need to talk about two things. You need to talk about how do you green the carbon and how do you green the hydrogen in the products. And you need to think about both of them. So the step one is how do you green the hydrogen? And we've said that it's costly, and we'll go through some of the numbers as to why we say that. So you need to green the H portion, the hydrogen. And then the step two, which we're going to show is difficult, we need to green the carbon portion as well. And so you can just see we've got a nice molecule there for those of you who can remember your high school chemistry. And the green is the hydrogen, and the maroon, if you like, is the carbon. So that's roughly speaking what Secunda makes carbon and hydrogen in a hydrocarbon. Right, with that background, let's talk about transformation of Secunda to green hydrogen in numbers. So one of the things I like to do, and where we did as a group, is to do some simple back of the envelope calculations. And if I want to get technical, that's called a Fermi calculation. Okay, so first of all, how much green hydrogen do we need to convert Secunda? And that's a simple mass balance and stoichiometry. I'm not going to bore you with how we calculated that, but this is also high school chemistry. So 2.1 million tons of green hydrogen is required. I just contextualize that as we speak today. About 300,000 tons of green hydrogen is made in the world. So that's a big number. That's a lot of green hydrogen. So how much, when you make green hydrogen, you need renewable electricity. That's what makes it green. So how much electricity do you need? You need 18.2 gigawatts on a continuous basis. Because just to state an obvious thing, Secunda, you can't turn it off at night, okay, and start it up in the morning. Doesn't work that way. You need that hydrogen 24/7. So how much is 18.2 gigawatts? It's 70% of current South African electricity demand. So it's a lot of electricity. How much is this going to cost? Green hydrogen power portion, and the details are in the report, 360 billion rand. The renewable electricity piece, 640 billion rand. These are estimates, that's we've put plus or minus in front of them. Top that up, 1 trillion rand. Remember, Sasol in its entirety has a turnover of about 275 billion rand. So this is way more than the turnover of Sasol. So I just let those numbers sink in. Right, what about the sustainable carbon piece? Let's think about that. So first of all, I'm going to quote the energy scholar Vaclav Smil. And we're going to talk about biomass. And so a nice sum that he did is he said, imagine that you're going to have a 1 gigawatt power plant and you're going to use biomass. And the most efficient form of biomass you can use is a monoculture forest. And so he ran the numbers for that 1 gigawatt power plant. And he said, right, you need a wood plantation of 3,300 square kilometers. What does that number mean? It's about 1.6 times the size of Mauritius. So my esteemed colleagues and co-presenters said to me actually yesterday, what does that mean in the context of Secunda? So I quickly ran those numbers last night. Secunda will need the equivalent of about 15 gigawatts. So for 15 times that amount. And the wood plantation required will be about 70% the size of Mpumalanga. So there's a very good reason why there aren't gigawatt scale power plants or biomass used at this scale. The land requirements are incredibly large. And of course, you have to grow these forests from scratch. So that's just something to think about. So I would like to say, and I think this is quite well recognized within the industry, biomass mass at this scale is simply not feasible. Right, then let's go to the ore. Okay, and then you'll find this in the research area. There's a thing called direct air carbon capture or flue gas recovery. So direct air capture means that we take the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere, we take that out, we get carbon dioxide. Or we do flue gas recovery. So if, for example, we go to the flue gas of a power station and we take the CO2 out of that. And of course, that's not sustainable, but we looked at both of those. All right. So this is also not commercially feasible. Let me just first of all say, we just looked at one aspect of it. So you have to start with 23.5 million tons of carbon dioxide as a feedstock. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about thermodynamics, and I don't want to go down the thermodynamics rabbit hole too much, but carbon dioxide is a combustion product. So if you want to use it as a feedstock, you need to convert it to carbon again. And that takes a lot of energy. And where does that energy come from? The energy comes from hydrogen, if we're going to be sustainable. So we talked about 2.1 million tons per annum of hydrogen required just to put into the product. That's for the CH2. But if we want to turn CO2 back into carbon or back into carbon monoxide so that we can turn it into hydrocarbons, we need another 1.07 million tons per annum of green hydrogen. Right, another 500 billion just for that. So now we've got 1.5 trillion, and we haven't even talked about the capital cost for direct air capture or flue gas recovery. So I'm going to boldly make the statement in the kicker box below. It is not technically or economically feasible to supply sustainable carbon to Secunda today. It's simply too costly, and there are, of course, technical issues as well. Things like direct air capture are not commercially proven at scale. All right. Right, here we are. That I'm going to hand over to Rod.
Thanks, Bruce and Tristan. So what does this mean for Secunda? Like all pieces of equipment, like your motor car, it reaches an end of its life. At that point, you can't repair it anymore, you need to replace it. The same is true of machinery at Secunda, and our calculations show that there's no reinvestment case for that kind of technology at that scale. If you go back and look at the numbers of what the original investments did to investment in South Africa, I'm talking about Sasol 2 and 3, there was a huge distortion of investment, particularly in manufacturing and in capital intensity. Anyway, for our purposes, it seems that reinvestment highly unlikely to be commercially attractive, even if Sasol was in a position to do that. And we've spoken in previous slides about that. So we think Secunda can probably operate to the end of its useful life if environmental pressures allow and the oil price allows. It's heavily dependent on the oil price. So the pressures we've talked about, high carbon intensity of this particular process, because remember what I said right in the beginning, this is a coal machine. It lives off coal. You can supplement it with gas, but you can't replace coal completely. We've seen the feedstock challenges with both coal and gas. We've got product price sensitivity as a challenge. We've got increasing production costs. We've got environmental pressures in South Africa and internationally. We've got declining production volumes, clearly shown in that graph Bruce showed. We've got declining profitability, and we've got some shareholder dissatisfaction, and we've got high debt levels. So, so that we don't want to appear alarmist, let's just make the simple point that industrial facilities don't last forever. nowhere in the world do they last forever. And Sasolburg and Secunda factories are no different. They will close. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And that's the issue that we have to grapple with. What should we do as a country? So in this country, there's a very strong regulatory dispensation that Sasol is covered by. And government holds powerful policy and regulatory levers which it could use and which will influence, if not determine, Secunda's future. There's environmental compliance, and we've already seen some recognition in government in accepting Sasol's way of calculating sulfur emissions. They are very substantial absolute numbers, but it's a very interesting prelude, perhaps, to other things. From an economic regulation point of view, Sasol's got problems. There's a case before the Competition Tribunal, and it's gone to the High Court of competing jurisdiction between NERSA, the economic regulator, and the Competition Commission. They have overlapping jurisdictions, and as a result, the gas industry today doesn't know which is the preeminent legislation and which should it cover. And we can go into some detail about things like that. So, for example, if you look at the non-discrimination provisions of the Gas Act and the similar provisions in the Competition Act, they are significantly different. And that's important because we need another tranche of natural gas in this economy. Where is it going to come from? Likely it will come from LNG. And effectively, the country will be back in 2027 when the gas cliff arrives, as it was in 2001, where we didn't have natural gas and it was an infant industry. So in effect, after 26 years, the country's starting all over again with an infant industry. But the point we're making is regulatory uncertainty is a real problem for investors who, and they are out there, who are keen to help South Africa resolve the gas cliff problem. And there's the question of carbon taxes. So what do we recommend from a policy point of view? All of the information and data used in this study is in the public domain. So anybody who wants to duplicate our efforts, please go ahead. The data is all there. There's also, at the end of the report, several pages of references. We went into a lot of detail and reference sources of various bits of information. So, yeah, just to make that point. So the point about this slide is that policymakers need to be prepared for what's coming. And they need to understand the consequences. If all this effort does just that, personally, I'll be quite pleased and relieved. And, you know, I do appreciate that DTIC is a bit focused on these things, but unfortunately, they're not the whole government. And outside of that, I wonder how much consciousness there is of this situation that the economy faces. So, and the real question is, what's the future of the petrochemical industry? If we lose it, what are we going to do? Because it all starts with coal in Secunda at the moment. So if you're going to lose that, what are you going to do? What's the future? And what are we going to do about it? Should we develop a plan? And even if we did, it would have to be necessarily, and Pam's remarks reinforce this point, a necessarily complex plan. And do we have, you know, the public service that could deliver and implement such a complex plan at this point in time? It's a big question for me. Should we wait to the last minute and then panic? That's also a way of proceeding, which is sometimes used in this country. And should we leave it to market forces, which is what is effectively happening? And the risk of that is that you get a sudden big dislocation. And maybe you don't want that. Maybe you would prefer to manage it rather than to have a sudden big dislocation. years ago when I went to Parliament discussing something similar, they talked about blood on the floor. We don't want blood on the floor, we were told. We also looked at what, if you lost this huge part of your economy, what could you put in its place? And in the report, we don't have time to cover it here. We looked at several possible options of what could possibly replace Secunda. None of them easy, none of them cheap, and all of them quite complex. So we come to the view that what's the best option would be a nuanced approach by government. And, you might argue there's some green shoots along that path already. But managing this twilight phase is not going to be easy and requires attention to a lot of different levers at the same time, which would need collaboration between a lot of stakeholders like shareholders, Sasol, government, funders, NGOs, trade unions, and so on. You want to have a managed transition. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, it's still morning. Well, 9 minutes before the morning ends. Good morning, everyone. And I mean, I think as I was seeing the authors come up one by one, I was like, how grossly unfair is this? You've got 3 people and only 1 person to respond. I think the paper tackles a very important topic, which is the transition trajectory of hard-to-abate sectors. And these are hard-to-abate sectors that are at the core of our industrial structure. So very much an important discussion for us as a country. Of course, they focus on chemicals, but some of the arguments and the tensions that are highlighted can be generalized to other industries as well. The full report, all 120 pages of it, is very detailed and does a very good job at mapping out the linkages with various aspects of the value chain and then the tensions and implications of some of the choices that Sasol might take then for other players in that value chain. And what really stood out for me in the paper is the framing of those tensions exactly for Sasol in particular. And this is always an important part of the development or industrial development discussion, because the devil always lies in the details. It's like how you are able to, in reality, play these things out. And what I really appreciated about the paper is the multidisciplinary approach to it. So you could see by the different presentations, there's technical discussions about production dynamics, financial analysis, and policy and regulatory discussions. And these are all key elements of us being able to succeed in the transition. So I think that this is how this paper was planned is really helpful. So I won't be able to comment on everything that the paper does and on the very deep analysis, but I will pick up on a few things just as comments. And to be absolutely clear, it doesn't mean that all my comments should have been incorporated into the paper. I think the authors would have had a very difficult time to extend it beyond the 100 pages that they already have. But perhaps for further research in this areas, then these are questions that might be considered as well. So I think where Rod ended was on the sunset phase of Sasol. And one of the elements that he highlighted is that part of how the sunset of Secunda plays out is dependent on the choices, be it policy or regulatory, that are made by the government. And I think it was Tristan or Bruce had already highlighted also that this actually doesn't fully lie in the hands of the government, because you've got what's happening with CBAM, where the policies are being designed and developed elsewhere in the world that either potentially close out markets for South Africa and other parts of the world as well, or potentially reduce our competitiveness significantly. So I think what I'm pointing to is the tightrope, even from a government perspective, that needs to be handled around planning out a transition pathway that would be supports transitioning to reducing emissions, but without leading to deindustrialization of the economy. Something else I think that has been quite topical in my mind, and this is because I work for a development finance institution, is the climate-related financial disclosures ecosystem, which is effectively designed to ensure that entities adhere to the global climate commitments by creating interdependencies for collective accountability. How does it do this? So in addition to, so firms, and Sasol does this, I've seen their reports, have to report on their emissions, right? And then, but Sasol's funders have to report on their portion of Sasol's emissions. And those funders, when they want capital, you know, it is a consideration in terms of, so what is your trajectory to reduce emissions over time? So this is another element, you know, that goes into, or a factor that is driving a decision in a particular way that we need to consider. So I think in addition then to the point around, there's all the South African stakeholders, there's the global environment, and it goes beyond the CBAMs of this world. It's the financial system that is also speaking to this. Then I'd like to talk, I think, maybe a little bit more about the engagements with the trade-offs and tensions that are faced. So I think the paper sketches out quite well the trade-offs that Sasol faces, as well as the implications for other stakeholders, including value chain participants and the government. However, I would have liked to see more in terms of broadening the trade-offs. So for instance, in the case of the trade-offs that are faced by the government. So one of the recommendations, for instance, is if Eskom, right, took the burden of the of reducing coal, it would allow Sasol more runway in terms of, you know, the closure being much later on. And then but we also need to think about, so what are the tensions that the government and Eskom face in making that choice? Right. So these are all very complex decisions that needed to be engaged with. So maybe though not covered in detail in this paper, in a follow-up research question would be then about complementing the existing analysis with that perspective, so we can find, as South Africa, you know, what is the best way forward, and then how do we come together to be able to implement the best solution. And yeah, so it really helps with then outlining the understanding, the collective understanding of the different role players in that ecosystem to deliver on those things. Then I think another potential recommendation or solution that was highlighted was really around the exemption from carbon emissions. And this stems from the detailed analysis that you saw on what it means, what carbon taxes mean for Sasol. So, I mean, in my mind, and also I didn't give the caveat up front, I'm speaking as myself, not as the MDC. So in my mind, we absolutely need both sticks and carrots. It cannot be that we are only focusing on sticks, right? So I think that there's definitely room for discussion around what would be the best way from a policy perspective to incentivize, both with the sticks and carrots, firms to transition, because we do definitely want to still have an economy in 2050 and post 2050. So deeper engagement around that is quite important. But something else that then comes up in my mind again is then, how do we engage with conditionalities, right? So an outright tax exemption on its own without conditionalities may not get us to where we're looking for. So again, another follow-up research is like, how do you start thinking and shaping conditionalities that can both be monitored and enforced that would drive things in that direction? And I mean, I think this is particularly important because we are also aware that all of this is happening at a time where there has been a trend of financialization of non-financial firms. And there's studies, including on Sasol, that shows that this is a fact, and they're not alone. It's a global trend. It's a global trend that is happening. And so linked to this is then, it's like, you know, CEOs are hired for 5 years and are expected to deliver value in the 5 years. This creates a tension between the 5 years and the long-term plan that a company needs to be able to have. So how do we manage those tensions? And we've also seen, and the paper engages with this, that in response to that, you've had shareholder activism. Right. But now the shareholder activism is also driving a particular creating new tensions within decision making of the firm. So these are all, I think, things and further mapping that I think would just help us to be able to really get to what the mechanisms and instruments that we could use to drive things, so that we could have the value creation for as long as possible, and potentially a transition. I still think that a transition of Sasol is possible. Then I have a few comments, particularly with regards to the discussion around green hydrogen, and particularly for use in fertilizers and other areas. So. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think given the length of the paper, I imagine that it was written over quite a long period of time. But I'm aware, for instance, one of the points it's made is that there's only one project, which was in Saudi Arabia, that has reached financial close. But recent reports show that in India, as well as other places, I'm happy to share, the table that we have. There are other projects that have come to financial close with regards to green hydrogen. And then, I mean, there are other elements in terms of the benchmarking that's done in the study. So, for instance, around cost, I think the study quotes $5 to $8 per kg. We have seen new projects, and one in South Africa, for instance, which is at 3 Rand to 330 per kg. So this is probably around, over time, things get better, things get improved, and therefore some of these numbers changed. But I mean, what I took away from that is that actually we might not want to take an absolute decision right now, because you are seeing these changes and prices are falling. If you think about it, when we started with renewable energy, the prices looked like this was something that we should never do. But we've seen how quickly the prices have started to fall in that regard as well. So it's really something that we should manage and keep a close eye on, including on all the technology and issues that were raised by the paper. Then I think maybe one last thought that I had was around the I guess, I don't know, is it an approach comment? So I would have liked to seen, I think, more engagement with different explanations of the observed phenomena. An example, so the discussion around the role of gas pricing in the gas cliff. There are alternative explanations that have been written about that are in tension with, the arguments made in the paper. And I worked on a paper quite some time ago, though, so it might be outdated, that it would have been good to say, even if to say it's not in agreement with that, but we are not following this approach because it has these particular weaknesses. So I think, I've said a bit, and obviously couldn't comment on the whole paper because it has so much material. But those were the kind of like immediate thoughts that came as I read the paper late last night and early this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for interesting paper. There are no immediate solutions. It is clear that not even Sasol will resolve some of the challenges raised here. So this requires partnership. So let me then allow for questions. I have my own questions, but as the chair, I don't want to, abuse the position. But yeah, I have a few questions from online participants. The first one is from Volp. So the question is are Sasol targets really appropriate and informed by financial modeling, given its financial position and health? The second question from Rai again, is South Africa not shooting itself in the foot when other countries like the US are not committing such ambitious targets? And Pamela, you can come in on that as well. The other question from Rai, and which I think, Rod, you have covered it in your presentation, whether is there any coordinated approach to address the issues raised in the report? yeah, my view is that that has been covered, but if you want to come in again on how that can be done, you are welcome to answer that. There's a question from Malene Arnoldi. The question is, what is Sasol's view on the findings? Did you share the report with Sasol? Or maybe in your research, did you engage with Sasol? So she just want to know that also given that Sasol has already started the pilot scale green hydrogen development program. So if you can answer that. There's a comment from Prof. Haro von Blotnitz, a professor of chemical engineering at UCT Energy Systems Group. Actually, he is commending you, the authors, for a very well-researched and written report raising a very important matter, which needs a public plan. So that is a comment more than a question. So I don't know whether do you want to answer this before I can open it up for further questions. Thank you.
So the answers will be very quick. Are Sasol's targets appropriate? My answer is ask Sasol. Is South Africa shooting itself in the foot? Well, that is a view, but as Pamela mentioned, and was mentioned in the presentation, there are things like CBAM out there. Whether you like it or not, these are your major trading partners. And if you want to keep them, you better comply or go somewhere else. So it's not totally up to South Africa. We're not an island in this global economy. Did we consult with Sasol? Yes, we consulted them right from the outset, and they did have opportunities to comment on drafts as we went along. So I think we did that okay. Yeah, I think we've answered the point about a coordinated approach. It's quite hard to coordinate things in this country, as we saw yesterday, but we still think it would be a better option than some of the others. And thank you to the learned professor who complimented us. Keep it short. I don't want to allow Bruce to get onto the hydrogen issue because he's written a lot on it and researched a lot on it. And, you know, there's this expression, poking the bear, Pamela. So if we unleash Bruce on hydrogen, we might be here for quite a long time. But maybe you two could take up the hydrogen debate offshore. There was some comment about, you know, Sasol looking into a hydrogen project. My understanding is the Buchu Bai project has been temporarily, it's on hold or suspended. It's not proceeding as far as I know. What is proceeding is a much more limited cooperation with Toyota and so on. So it's not really green hydrogen yet. It might be something that happens in the future. But yeah, I think let's go on with other questions, Tebogo, unless my colleagues have got violent objections to anything I've said.
All right. Colleagues, please can raise your questions. Introduce yourself and your organization, please.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Patel. I'm an economist here at TIBS, senior economist here at TIBS. Just to borrow the analogy of Dr. Rod, it was a great symphony by the choir and a good underlying composition. So I guess a few comments. One was, this year, a few months back, the Reserve Bank put out a paper on the carbon tax. And you know, essentially the critique was that, you know, as it's currently enforced in South Africa, it's quite low. There's lots of exemptions. But one of the important things that came out from the research was that they said a carbon price for emerging economies is consistent with a price in excess of $50 per ton. Now, I'm just thinking back to your heuristic model. That's going to bring the profitability concerns much more sooner for Sasol, should that sentiment materialize and should that translate into policy. So I guess that's just a comment. We don't know what the pressures are going to be like and how that might translate into actual domestic policy and carbon tax policy. The second was, also just to reflect also on the consequences. So as you have mentioned, there's very important linkages to downstream value chains, polymers, plastics. Where are we gonna get the upstream chemicals for that? We're gonna start importing polymers like propylene, polypropylene. What happens to fertilizers and explosives downstreams as well? So yeah, just a few comments, and thanks so much for the presentation. It was very interesting, and it was very clear that there needs to be a lot more thinking around this and how this is managed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. My name is Seni Anamo, an associate professor of economics at UNISA. Recently, there have been announcements in the media, and I think one of them is about 17 hours ago, focusing on investments in the petrochemicals sector. For instance, there's a company in Mexico that's looking at $1 billion to be injected towards reviving this sector, with acknowledgement that it was on the decline, decreased production. And then there's also a fairly recent announcement of about $45 billion in the case of India. So I'm curious about any success stories in other parts of the world where this industry is actually doing well. And also, if perhaps you've looked at case studies similar to Sasol. And in that context, what has been the case regarding to managed transition? Because when I look at this report and the last sentence, that slide, just by listening at the response, at the report and the presentation, to me, then it means we are actually very late in terms of having that discussion on managed transition. What is being done currently? I think it would be interesting to know, because if the situation is as what has been painted, then definitely there should have been something significant towards this managed transition. Thank you.
So there was a point mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about the production of liquid fuels and the production of chemicals at Secunda, and how producing both of those categories of products are essential. So can you just shed some light on the refinery economics? Is it at all possible to just produce chemicals at Secunda, or are the refinery economics so complex that you can only do it when you're producing liquid fuels and chemical products? Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, it's Mike Veazey from U2 Ethanol. I've noticed recently that Sasol are embarking into biofuel, but there was no comment at all about biofuels. And we actually have business in KwaZulu-Natal. We own a distillery, and we are repurposing an old chemical plant, which we can take up to about 150 to 200 million liters per annum of bioethanol. Sasol, I see, are talking to Anglo American about going into biodiesel. We've noticed that the Sugar Association of South Africa is looking at repurposing the old engine refinery to produce bioethanol. Is this not on the table? And then just another comment, I recently met, in fact, 2 days ago, with the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And despite South Africa having a biofuel industrial policy dating back to 2007 and a biofuel regulatory framework, nobody in government can give us any direction on how it should be priced. So, I think Sasol embarking on this, they're going to have to get the pricing model right as well. But certainly there's a huge opportunity there.
John Williams from Resco Asset Management. Could we please have a prognosis on destoning? It's obviously a very important project. What is your view on how successful that's going to be? So what will the impact of destoning be, given that we've got this slightly confusing, relatively small capital spend to repurpose a plant whose capacity is 10 million tons of coal per annum, if I understand it. So I struggle to understand how that kind of works. And then secondly, briquetting. How successful do you think that's going to be? That seems to be a very important part of the turndown strategy. What's your prognosis for that? And then the third question is, you mentioned that when you take down 10% of gas, that's more than 10% of product because of the stoichiometry, because you've got CH4. Understand that. What's the number? 10% gas equals what? 15% product? That's my sort of rough guess, but obviously you know far better than I. So 3 detailed questions for me. Thank you.
So Tristan and Bruce will handle most of these questions, but I'll handle the biofuels one because I'm the one to blame in this country for introducing it into government years ago when I worked there. And we did lots of studies about pricing. And the problem is there are too many moving targets. And basically, it's just not a commercial proposition. It would have been happening on a large scale, but it isn't. Maybe in your case, you found a niche that will work. Congratulations, all strength to your elbow on that. But in the US, we know, I'm sure, bioethanol, 50 US cents a gallon subsidy, straight. Translate that to rands on the petrol price. I mean, it's just not affordable in this economy. The other thing, as an energy person, I talk about is energy return on energy invested. The energy invested in doing biofuels on a large scale is more than you get as return. So, as I always tell the sugar farmers, get down on your knees and thank the Brazilians for saving the global sugar market and diverting all their surplus sugar into fuels and subsidizing it for years because they saved the global sugar industry. So, yeah, biofuels, we didn't look at it. It's a big subject all on its own. It's in its infancy here. We know there's recycling of sunflower oil from fish and chip shops and things like that, but not agriculturally at scale.
It is viable. It's just depending on how it's priced. So if it's line priced at the basic fuel price plus the levies, and those levies are not then payable by the biofuel or the bioethanol industry, then it's totally viable. You can produce a litre of ethanol for about 11 Rand a litre.
So go for it. Go for it.
We will as soon as government can give us a direction. And we've had several meetings
government
with
direction. That's
SARS.
my point. If you need a government direction, what you really mean is you need a subsidy of some kind.
We don't need a subsidy.
Or some kind of support. If you don't need it, then go for it.
Yeah.
Go. The market is there waiting for it.
The problem is that the petroleum industry is so regulated that you have to, if we're selling to Total Energies, they want to understand what is our pricing model, how do we sell it, and we can actually even give them a discount for blending, so it covers their blending costs. Yeah, but we do want to do it. Yeah. So when I say 11, that's the cost of producing it. There's also your capital cost on top. It'll work out to about 15 Rand a litre.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Bruce and Tristan for the other questions.
Okay, I'm going to have a stab at destoning. So first of all, I'm going to wear my relative ignorance on my sleeve. So I'm not a coal expert, but I'm going to, in the spirit of the Dunning-Kruger effect, I'm going to step into the destoning. I think what I'd like to say about destoning, I'd like Tristan's perspective as well. As far as I'm aware, this is a commercially proven technology which is applied all over the world. So destoning is not something that's new, and I can, therefore make the assumption that that this should work. The project obviously has to be executed well, and on the assumption that it is, destoning should work. Okay, then let me move on to briquetting, and that is covered in quite some detail in the report. The issue with briquetting is that this is, at this scale, not a commercially proven technology. So that means that there's a pioneering aspect to the technology, and it's, you know, it's a lot of fine coal that would need to be briquetted. So that will be very, very challenging to implement by 2030. So those are my two comments on destoning and briquetting. And before we move off that, maybe Tristan add a couple of words. What have I missed? What have I got wrong?
Yeah, I'm going to try and also avoid Dunning-Kruger. I think on briquetting is well, Sasol announced they'd done detailed calculations in 2021 with a plan up to 2030. It appears that briquetting is at the center of that, because when you mine all of this coal, you make a huge amount of fines. Now you have to do something with it. And so if you can do something with it, a whole lot of stars align and you get a neat and elegant plan. But obviously all the parts of the plan have to work, and briquetting is one of the pivotal points. It can't be cheap. One of the nice ways to test yourself is, are other people doing it around the world at scale? And the answer is not, obviously. So that would suggest it's not a cheap way of mining coal, of getting a hold of coal. You'd rather mine it fresh. It doesn't mean it's not a good solution, but then the question comes, you're doing it at world first scale. You've got 5 years left. You've got to build it, get it going. It's got to fit in nicely and work. You can't afford to interrupt Secunda in this process. So I think, as we indicated, there's a lot of moving parts that have to come together economically in a fairly short period of time. I think you mentioned a question of did we try and benchmark against other just energy transitions? It's hard in the coal space. There's not a lot of it. Secunda is almost one of a kind up until around 2010, when China started building a lot of coal gasifications and gas processes and quite a few CTLs. I think there's over 7 million tons of CTL there. They aren't, to my knowledge, doing much. But remember, CO2 is a country picture. You know, we would first and foremost committing Paris at a country level, and then it has to roll down somewhere. And so if you look at the bigger picture in China, the amount of, well, both their growth in CO2 still from the 2000s, but also the amount of growth in renewables, wind and energy, create a lot of opportunities for them to do fairly free renewables compared to what Sasol is going to have to pay for. So there are some examples, but I guess the takeaway is it's tackled at a country level. Yeah, in terms of co-production, with money, anything is possible. Question is whose money. But I think economically, you can tweak a little, but it's fairly hard-coded into the system. And it's already a 50-50 blend of fuels and chemicals, starting from a much fuel-richer environment in the 90s. Changing it to somewhere else without lots of money and effort, I think will be very difficult. I think for the other questions, perhaps if the people asking can repeat.
There are questions, additional questions I am having.
From the audience, have we missed any? I think 15 is a good number. It's important. It's not going to break the piggy bank, but there's lots of straws that are adding up, and that's one of them.
All right. Let me see. So Pamela, there is a question for you on your assumptions that the transition for Sasol is possible. It's a question from Jesse Armstrong saying, can you please share with us your assumptions on that, you know? And then there are quite a number of questions. So there's a question from Bridget Sitsedi on is nuclear an option for Sasol? Did you consider that? Again, from Raul Hossein, how many jobs will be lost in Secunda when Sasol closes? Right. So those are the online questions. Do you have additional questions on the floor? All right, let me then abuse the position that I'm having. With regards to CBAM, and I mean, how do we counter the impact of CBAM in South Africa? So carbon tax is one option. But what Pamela raised also is the incentives, the role of incentives to transit or to allow for a transition, and I don't see here the role of fiscal policy in facilitating that transition. Because for me, that's important. If we are going to rely on shareholders only or in the main to do that, for me, again, it's moral suasion, right? It depends on the return on investments. So this is also a public policy problem, which will then require the state to come in. Sasol itself was again facilitated by the state when it started. So we can't expect here this to be a problem of business. Again, Rod, you raised the issue of distortions in investment. So we know that ideally the tax system must be neutral, no, and not create distortions. But we know very well that the CBAM will create distortions. Carbon tax will create distortions in the market. But how do we counter those distortions? So that's an issue for me. The other issue, I don't hear investments in clean coal technologies, right? What is called the HELO coal, basically high efficiency, low emission coal. Is it something that can be considered as part of the transmission mechanism? And lastly, the issue of the public interest considerations. So there's a question raised there on the impact on the jobs, but what's going to happen in towns like Sasolburg and Secunda if then Sasol closes down? It's a public policy problem, because then the government will have to come in through social grants. So it's the same issue we are dealing with AMSA and Secunda. If the plant closes down there, we are going to have to use social grants or the social wages to counter the effects, and which is not sustainable, as you know. But how do we then start planning now to prevent or avert the challenge that might accrue in Secunda and Sasolburg? I've read, the recommendations, but the action plans, as to when, by who, and the instruments for that. For me, those are critical issues to consider. Yeah, over to you. Thanks.
Oh, it's working. So I think the question was around what are my assumptions around saying that there is a possibility for Sasol to be able to transition. So maybe let me focus on one of the challenges that were highlighted by the paper in this regard, which is probably the biggest, and that is the cost of green hydrogen, and then what it means, of course, for the financial implications of the company. So if we look at the cost of green hydrogen, it depends on a number of things, and this includes renewable energy costs, the transport of that, renewable energy to where it would be processed, and that transport cost is directly linked to the mechanism of transport. Is it, are you transporting it as electricity on the grid? Is there grid capacity? Are you converting it into ammonia and putting it through a pipeline? And then, which also means with the location of the source of renewable energy matters as well. There's also cost and availability of water, which is, a key component of that production. So what this points to is the importance of the existence of an ecosystem, right? Because if the ecosystem around green hydrogen fully exists, then we could reduce the cost quite a but I think by quite a bit. And this is what actually the work of the green hydrogen commercialization strategy has been trying to do. It is around seeking to or trying to coordinate the development of that ecosystem so that we can land at a reasonable cost of green hydrogen production, as we transition. And the IDC, which is the institution that I work for, has also been working actively regarding this. So we're engaging with different stakeholders and potential investors at different levels of the value chains at the ecosystem. We're engaging with Transnet around, the issues around logistics around it. We are very much alive to the challenges that are faced, by some of the stakeholders, and are really trying to deal with these issues at the same time. But regardless of this, we know that in the short term, the cost of hydrogen is going to be high. So how we are dealing with that in particular is engaging with export markets that are willing to pay pay the contract for difference, right? Because there are countries, Japan, South Korea, who have clearly indicated that they want green hydrogen, and Sasol could export a portion of that production. And they're willing to pay for the difference between the alternative price, which would be for gray alternatives, and the green hydrogen premium, right? And then there's also around the applications of green hydrogen, even for Sasol, differ, and they would not necessarily, I think there's also obviously a lot of thinking about engineering and what this means for production, but it would not necessarily be you are doing it for producing fuel immediately. Some of the use cases, and I think the paper really engages with this, are much closer to competing with the gray alternatives as well. So for instance, I think there was a question in the audience earlier about what is the thinking around fertilizer and explosives. Actually, through the modeling that we've done, the fertilizer application is probably one of the closest to cost competitiveness, and this is because the cost of fertilizers, both in South Africa and even worse in the region, are very high. In the region, I think this is about double the world price. So that means we've got coverage. You need to understand value chain inefficiencies in order for you to resolve the problems correctly. But this is certainly a potential. We're importing quite, I think, a reasonable amount of ammonia as well, which is used in production. So there are projects that are being considered, not yet at financial close, that could produce green ammonia for fertilizer production in South Africa. And so this doesn't necessarily have to be Sasol, actually, because it could be a standalone, separate, smaller project. But these are possibilities. So as these prices go down, and I think the hard work is around figuring out, mapping all of these possibilities, and then what's happening to the price, to the cost drivers, so that you can take the investment decisions at the appropriate time. Thanks.
Well, I'll have a crack at some of these, and my colleagues will come in on the other points. Is nuclear an option? Well, remember, that machine in Secunda wants carbon molecules and hydrogen molecules. So what is nuclear going to do? suppose you mean make electricity from nuclear. We know that's going to be the most expensive form of electricity available, and it has, several 100,000 years of waste to deal with. So what could it do? Well, it's not renewables, so I don't know how you would classify it that way, but you could use electricity to make hydrogen, but you're still left with the carbon part. How would nuclear solve that part? I don't know. Maybe.
So how long would it take to build a nuclear scale?
Yeah, I mean, these nuclear plants, all of them are running late and well over budget in most of the world. So that's another big problem, particularly to build one in this country where we haven't done it for, when was Coburg built? 1970s, I think. So 50 years ago. So the skills we had have largely gone. So it would be difficult. And it would only partially solve one of the problems and do it in a very expensive way. So, yeah. How many jobs would be lost? So I think the point is that how many jobs have already been lost? I mean, since the 1980s, Secunda has been restructuring, and the job numbers have gone down and down and down. Same at Sasol head office. They've had umpteen restructurings and people being laid off. Coal mines are not infinite. They come to an end, and some of them are coming to an end and have come to an end. The number of coal miners has already gone down considerably. So it's not a once-off event. The indications are that maybe Secunda can close in chunks, in parts, but not all at once. And then if you think about it in the long run, what's the environmental liability of cleaning up the Secunda site? Let's say you close it completely. That number is huge. So it would be worthwhile to keep some activity going on that site, just to kick that can down the road for as long as possible. So I don't think there'll be no jobs at Secunda for a long time. There might be very few, but the number, I think it's on the second slide, is 24,000 in the country. But I mean, there's a lot of smart people that work at Sasol. They're going to come up with something. And that links to Tebogo's raft of questions. One of the things Sasol is saying to shareholders and researchers is that we've got things up our sleeve. We can't tell you yet because we're not ready. So maybe there are answers coming. They're not ready to divulge them yet. And maybe that will deal with it. In answer to your other questions about CBAM and how do we counter it and so on, I mean, we said somewhere that government is holding a lot of levers. And it really wasn't the brief of this research to say which levers should be pulled when and so on. But I'm sure if you and I and my colleagues sat down in the afternoon, we could draft a plan quite quickly. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is finding the money in this economy and finding the collaboration amongst all the competing stakeholders with all the competing interests. So it's the political part, I would submit, is much more difficult than drawing up a plan. Drawing up a plan, fiddling with taxes and so on, I can do that in an afternoon. Not very difficult. It's all the other work which has to be done. And, your point about Sasolburg and Secunda and so on, and if you drive around this wonderful country of ours, the landscape is littered with previous economies that are defunct now. Go to KwaZulu-Natal, look at the leather and the wattle industry. It was a huge part of the KwaZulu-Natal industry. Shoemaking, leather tanning, and wattle growing. Where is it now? Gone. Where are those towns? Mostly gone. Look at the ostrich industry. Mostly gone. Look at the wool industry. Mostly gone. And of course, let's not forget mining. How many abandoned mines are there? How many old mining towns are derelict today? It's not a new thing. The only thing that's new is now we say there should be a just transition. There was no just transition for all those people. I mean, look at the landline telephone industry, completely replaced almost by cell phones and so on. So, these things are happening all the time. The only difference this time, in my view, is that we now have to talk about a managed transition. In the past, nobody cared. Technology moved on brutally. But maybe my colleagues want to weigh in on any of these issues I haven't covered.
Yeah, rather than let Bruce have a chance on hydrogen, I'll have a crack at it. I think Nome is the poster child for large hydrogen projects, as Bruce mentioned earlier. But I think that's the headline. The question is somebody has to pay, and that somebody is a customer, and somebody has to guarantee the capital that's out there. So I mean, Air Products is a huge multi-tens of billion-dollar company, is in there with the Saudis who have lots of money. So with money, you can make things happen. I think for the other projects that are out there, these are in Europe. If you have $100 a ton carbon price, then the economic optimum shifts. And at $100, you will move away from natural gas in Europe, and you will go to renewable electricity, electrolyzers, hydrogen, and you make that change. But that's at $100 carbon price. You're seeing those investments. Some of them, so that's with a explicit carbon price in the economy. I think some of the other projects are in the US. The Inflation Reduction Act made available hundreds of billions of dollars of funding for these sorts of projects. And so it all comes down to money. Where's it coming from?
Last word on green hydrogen. I'm not going to speak for long on green hydrogen. Yes, I promise. I think that the whole green hydrogen thing is largely out of scope for the Secunda thing specifically. And I think we can, Rod is right. I've done a lot of work on green hydrogen, and I can bore you with a lot of stuff on green hydrogen, but I don't think now is the time to do that. I think that the green hydrogen stuff that we've put in the presentation and in the analysis, insofar as we deal with Secunda specifically, speaks for itself, in my opinion. And I'm happy to engage with anyone on that specific topic. And then the larger green hydrogen topic, I think, is something for another day.
Okay. There are additional questions, and I'm mindful of the time. We are left with about 13 minutes, but there are questions from Ronald Ragwasha. So the question is, without value chain ecosystem approach, as well as financial and policy innovation, renewable energy feedstocks won't be feasible. So I think that's a statement. Comments. So there's another question from Sisa Njigelana. In addition, please speak to the impact of jobs in value chains linked to Sasol. Question from Prof. Haro Blotnitz. Could Sasol not send their fines to Eskom, whose mills give trouble, and rather buy coarse coal that Eskom tries to mill? So that's question. So there's a statement again from Sisan Jingelana. Correction, Dr. Crompton, not all nuclear power projects are delayed. Check those built in Russia, China, and South Korea. Yeah. All right. And lastly, on my side, it's your view on the costs. Because costs are dynamic, right? So they're not static. But it might be expensive for investments in green hydrogen now relative to other sources of energy. But there's a first mover advantage, which you must not forget. And also with Sasol, with the Fisher-Tropsch process, when it was commercialized at a scale in South Africa, that made Sasol what it is today. So, our view and analysis on costs should not be on the finances per se, but the multiplier effects associated with the investments, particularly the first mover advantage, that will be able to own the intellectual property rights, which will then also provide returns over a long period of time. Your views on that. And I will also then, as you are answering, also your comments, on last words on what needs to be done. Oh, there's a question that's
Thank you. My name is Tulani, and I am from KZN. I'm representing Traded Investment KwaZulu-Natal. I think this is a very special case, particularly understanding that South Africa is trying to transition into more greener energy solutions, and that chemical sector is one of the important sectors for my province where I come from. But I just want to understand, I haven't looked at the paper extensively, but I just want to understand, is there a section where it evaluates the cost of or the economic impact of losing Sasol altogether against what would be required to save it? I think it would be interesting to understand that part, considering, of course, other role players that benefit from the existence of Sasol in terms of jobs and economic contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's another question at the back. Sorry.
One last one and a quick one. So we've spoken about direct capture from other people's stacks, but what about direct capture from Sasol stack? In the early days of carbon capture and storage, everyone was very excited with their 94% CO2 pure stream. And we're thinking that was maybe one of the easiest ways that we could unlock that opportunity for a different type of carbon sinking. Can we take the carbon from there, or would economic carbon storage change things a little bit?
Thank you.
Perhaps I'll start with that. I think the thing to recognize is it's not about the 94%, it's about what the other 6 is critically important. And over and above that, if you're aiming for net zero, you can't start with coal. You've now recycled it once, so now you're down at 50%. So ultimately, in the long run, you're going to have to transition to water as a source of hydrogen, or maybe biomass if you're in special places in the world like Sweden and a few other places. And I don't think it's even recognized in Europe at the moment, capturing of industrial emissions because of this. Because in the long run, and you can argue, should we have a transition step before the long run? It's not going to cut it.
I just want to preface what I'm saying is Tristan and I are like an old married couple. We squabble a lot, but always in a good way. So I'm just going to add to what Tristan said, and I don't completely agree. But remember, if you start with CO2, as the point I made, you need more hydrogen, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. So wherever you get the CO2 from, and you're quite right, you can get it from Secunda. You're going to need to make lots of hydrogen, and that's going to cost a lot of money.
I think the reason why the world has a lot of CO2 in it is it's a great place to end up, but it's a lazy molecule, and trying to get it excited to do things again takes lots of time, energy, and money.
Caesar and Jikana, lovely to hear from you again, as usual. We always have interesting views to share. How many jobs have we lost on all the value streams? A really difficult question to answer precisely. Short answer, a hell of a lot, because those petrochemicals feed into all kinds of chemicals, plus all kinds of other manufacturing, even steel manufacturing. So it's very hard it would be a difficult research job to answer your question with any precision. Then Ronald's question about the value chain ecosystem approach. Yeah, it's just a big and complex piece of research. And it would be a nice way to go, but that wasn't our brief for this piece of research. Maybe we can add it to Pamela's list of further research that needs to be done. Then Tebogo, on your question about green hydrogen being the first mover advantage and so on, my plea is there are risks involved, And if there are people willing to take those risks, by all means, do so. We've got a gentleman here who's taking risks on ethanol. By all means, please go ahead, but please not use taxpayers' money to take these big risks on trying to be the first mover advantage. That would be my plea, because it involves a few people making calls on difficult issues. When government put so much money into Secunda, it was a different world. It was a lager mentality. The country thought it was under attack. It had all sanctions. It wasn't a commercial approach. But now we live in a commercial world, and my plea would be, don't use taxpayers' money to take these big risks, but help other people take those risks by all means. It's like, we should think about hydrogen like we think about rooibos and diamonds. Rooibos, we used to call oncrate. It's a weed. And if you can sell it in Tokyo at 12 Rand a kilogram, wonderful. But please don't ask taxpayers to subsidize that. Same with diamonds. They're just stones. You export stones, make a lot of money, please go for it. But don't ask taxpayers to subsidize the mining of those stones. That's the approach I think we should take. And then, the cost-benefit analysis. Since democracy, there's only ever been one cost-benefit analysis study done by the government, and that was the proposed Mafuta project, the other coal to liquids project years ago, and that was done by the presidency. If it comes back into fashion in government, please, by all means, do cost-benefit analysis on all of these schemes that are being dreamt up. But and that will help you identify where the real risks are and who's carrying those risks. But did we do a cost-benefit analysis? No. We didn't look at what exactly would be needed to keep Secunda alive. It's a very complicated question once you drill below the surface. So that wasn't our brief. But, we might be happy to look into it if someone has the money for that research. It would be a lot. Thanks. Okay. And thank you very much, everybody, for the questions. They have been very interesting. And thank you, Pamela, for your remarks.
Lastly, on my side, why is Sasol not interested in the liquefied natural gas? I mean, you made a statement that Sasol is not.
They say they can't afford it. Remember, the gas they're getting from Mozambique, which they're using now, they own that gas in Mozambique. They're not buying it. Well, I mean, technically they're buying it from Sasol International, but it's the same company that owns the gas which is selling it. With LNG, they don't own any LNG facilities. They don't own any gas that I know of anywhere else in the world. They'll be buying other people's gas. It's expensive to deliver it to South Africa, and they have said they can't afford it. 2 years before COVID, they said they could afford it. I remember a seminar in which Sasol representatives said that that was hosted, but now they say they can't. I'm sure they've done their sums.
Yeah, let me allow for closing remarks.
Well, okay. All I'm going to say is thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for TIPS for initiating this work. It's been an honor and a privilege to do the work. I don't think there's anything more I want to say.
Thanks. I'd like to just echo Bruce's comments.
I'd like to take a minute or two. So, I mean, I wanted to touch on the points that were raised by Tristan with regards to green hydrogen, and then maybe close off from my perspective. So, I mean, I think was interesting is because, earlier we were having the discussion about how using just sticks is not the right way to go about it. And then you've highlighted that in the countries where you have seen these projects moving forward, it's when the carbon price or the carbon tax has been really high. So obviously, I mean, it depends on, how deep the pockets are. But I think it speaks to maybe it's not about reducing the carbon tax that we would need to do from a South African perspective, but then seeing the right balance of the sticks and carrots to be able to drive things in that regard. And then, I mean, I think you mentioned quite a few examples of the green hydrogen projects that are in financial close that are effectively in developed countries. There's a project in India that is in partnership with Japan, and this is because there's a contracting for difference that's happening, which is what we're trying to achieve even in South Africa, speaking to the people that are willing to buy and pay the price premium for the green hydrogen. I thought just to highlight those things. Then in closing, I think one thing that the paper highlighted was how integrated the outputs of Sasol are to the rest of the economy. So then if we are thinking about what our economy looks like in 2070, in 2100, and not thinking about only what's happening in Sasol, but what's happening in all the downstream industries. If the carbon taxes, and I mean, we're seeing it started with Europe, the UK is looking at it, and there are other countries that are also considering carbon taxes. So this means that it's not only Sasol producing, the chemicals, but the plastics industries, the industrial chemicals industries, they are going to be taxed for the emissions and that. So what does it mean for competitiveness of that whole value chain? So that is, I think, worth us coming together and really thinking about how do we ensure. And remember, I mean, I think that the authors have been quite clear that they are speaking particularly to the application of hydrogen in Sasol. But the production of hydrogen from a South African perspective also links to the production of green steel. So what happens to our steel imports if we exports, sorry, not imports, if we aren't able to transition? And it's also like a few other industries. So in thinking about us wanting to have an economy when all of these regulatory instruments are attached globally, we do really need to think about the transition. The technology changes that are happening are but one aspect of it. And I mean, it's when Rod was talking about how you see ghost towns it's personal. In the Eastern Cape, there was a vibrant factory production around Butterworth, which is where I'm from, and all of those are closed down. And we do, to some degree, want to limit the impact of these things. So this work is an important input in terms of thinking about that, and we need to continue testing the ideas that are coming and seeing if we can have solutions so that we have, industrial production at the end of the transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on the way forward, my appeal then, Son, and you, Pamela, being members of the think tank, right, is that this work at least must be presented at the think tank. So through you, Son, can you propose that it be presented there, and if possible, other ministers be invited, and particularly the Minister of Minerals and Petroleum Resources, including the Minister of Finance. So that is my proposal, because this is a serious economic issue to be resolved. So we don't have the luxury of time. But yeah, let me leave it at that level and thank our speakers for very useful and interesting paper, which I will also share with my principals. But formally, I will ask Sol to process it further. Thank you very much for attending the session, and those who are online as well. Thank you. We are done.